If silence could measure time, the ICU had already become a place where time no longer behaved like the outside world. It bent, it slowed, and it crushed everything inside it. The first thing Ethan Cole heard was not a voice, but the steady alarm tone echoing through the hospital corridor, a sound that carried too much meaning to be ignored. Within minutes of arrival, Ava Johnson was already inside the intensive care unit, surrounded by machines that tracked every fragile sign of life, her condition unstable enough that even experienced doctors avoided absolute predictions. Ethan stood just beyond the glass doors, dressed in a dark tailored suit that made him look out of place in a medical environment, yet his presence changed the atmosphere immediately, as if the room itself acknowledged a different kind of authority had arrived. Dr. Michael Grant approached cautiously, holding a tablet with real-time data, his expression controlled but tense as he explained that Ava had been admitted in critical condition after a rapid medical decline with no immediate confirmed cause. Ethan did not respond at first, his eyes fixed on Ava through the glass, her face pale under the sterile hospital lighting, surrounded by quiet urgency and medical precision. Around him, nurses moved faster than usual, not out of panic, but out of awareness that something significant had shifted in the hospital hierarchy. Dr. Grant continued speaking, mentioning that the first response window had been delayed slightly due to overlapping intake procedures, a detail that would normally be routine, except in this case every minute mattered. Ethan finally spoke in a low controlled voice, asking how long the delay had been. The answer was brief but uncertain, and that uncertainty lingered longer than the words themselves. For a moment, Ethan's attention drifted not to the machines, but to memory, fragments of Ava Johnson from his home, quiet movements in hallways, careful attention to details no one else noticed, the kind of presence that never demanded recognition yet somehow shaped the environment around her. He remembered her not as someone who spoke often, but as someone who acted with consistency, and that memory now collided with the image of her lying inside the ICU, dependent on systems he did not control. A monitor beep increased slightly in pace, drawing brief attention from the medical team, and Ethan's posture shifted subtly, not in panic, but in focus. Dr. Grant explained that they were stabilizing her condition, but the situation remained highly sensitive and subject to sudden changes. Ethan nodded once, then asked for complete access to all admission records, not as a request, but as a directive that carried immediate weight. The hospital staff nearby exchanged brief glances, realizing that the situation had moved beyond standard medical interaction. Outside the ICU, the corridor felt narrower, quieter, and more controlled, as if the presence of Ethan Cole had introduced a new layer of pressure into the building. And as he remained standing there, looking through the glass at Ava Johnson, it became clear that what was unfolding inside this hospital was no longer just about medical urgency, but about something far deeper that was only beginning to reveal itself. The corridor outside the intensive care unit had already begun to feel different, as if the hospital itself had adjusted its rhythm to match the presence of Ethan Cole. Every movement around him appeared more controlled, every conversation slightly lowered, and every passing staff member seemed aware that something beyond routine medical procedure was now unfolding. Inside the ICU, Ava Johnson remained surrounded by machines that continued to track her unstable condition with mechanical precision, each sound in the room marking a fragile balance between stability and uncertainty. Dr. Michael Grant returned with updated records on a tablet, his expression more serious than before, and his tone careful as he explained that the initial intake process had included a delay between registration and emergency escalation that did not fully align with standard protocol. Ethan listened without interruption, his eyes still fixed on Ava through the glass, but his attention had shifted into a more structured form of focus, as if he was now reconstructing every moment leading to her current condition. Dr. Grant continued, stating that the hospital system had routed Ava through multiple intake points due to overlapping shift transitions, and while this was not uncommon in high-volume emergency situations, the timing in her case created a critical gap in response. Ethan finally spoke, asking for clarification on exactly who authorized the delay in transfer to intensive care. The question was calm, but it carried an immediate weight that changed the atmosphere around them. Dr. Grant hesitated before responding that responsibility appeared distributed across multiple roles, with no single point of clear accountability identified yet. That answer lingered in the air longer than expected, not because it was complex, but because of what it implied about the system that had failed to act decisively in time. Ethan turned slightly toward the ICU glass again, his reflection faintly overlapping with the image of Ava lying inside under controlled medical supervision. For a brief moment, his thoughts shifted into memory, recalling the quiet presence she maintained in his household, her consistent attention to details that others overlooked, and the absence of any demand for recognition despite her steady contribution to the environment around her. Those memories now contrasted sharply with the clinical environment in front of him, where her existence had been reduced to monitored signals and controlled readings. A nurse nearby adjusted an IV line with careful precision, while another staff member checked the monitor readings, each movement reflecting heightened awareness of the situation. Dr. Grant explained that they were continuing stabilization procedures, but the condition remained highly sensitive, and even minor changes could shift the outcome significantly. Ethan nodded once, then requested full access to all internal logs related to Ava Johnson's admission, treatment timing, and staff interactions from the moment she entered the hospital. His voice remained controlled, but the expectation within the request was absolute. The surrounding staff exchanged brief glances, recognizing that the request was no longer within standard administrative flow, but now part of a deeper investigation forming in real time. The hospital corridor remained quiet, yet the silence had transformed into something more structured, as if every sound was being measured against an invisible standard. And as Ethan Cole continued to stand outside the ICU, looking through the glass at Ava Johnson, it became increasingly clear that the situation was no longer defined only by medical urgency, but by a growing search for clarity within a system that had already begun to reveal its own fractures. The hospital corridor outside the intensive care unit had grown quieter, but not calmer, as if the silence itself had become structured under the presence of Ethan Cole. Every movement within sight of him felt measured, deliberate, and restrained, as though the entire medical staff had unconsciously adjusted their behavior to match the intensity of the situation. Inside the ICU, Ava Johnson remained under continuous monitoring, her condition unchanged in visible form but still unstable according to the steady fluctuations of medical equipment surrounding her. Dr. Michael Grant returned again, this time accompanied by a hospital compliance officer carrying a sealed digital report. The atmosphere around them carried a noticeable shift, no longer just medical concern, but procedural seriousness that extended beyond routine care. The compliance officer explained that the hospital had begun a full reconstruction of Ava Johnson's admission timeline, cross-referencing electronic logs, staff shift records, and emergency intake reports. Ethan listened without interruption, his focus steady, his expression unchanged, but his attention now fully engaged with the structure of the information being presented. The report indicated that Ava had been moved through multiple intake checkpoints within a compressed timeframe that did not align with standard emergency escalation protocols. Dr. Grant carefully added that while no single error had yet been officially identified as intentional, the sequence of delays and transitions created a gap in critical response time that required further investigation. Ethan finally spoke, asking in a calm voice whether any individual had been repeatedly involved across multiple stages of that intake sequence. The compliance officer hesitated before confirming that one coordinating staff member appeared across several access points during the critical window, though their authority level and intent were still under review. That information settled into the space without immediate reaction, but it shifted the tone of the entire environment. Ethan turned slightly toward the ICU glass again, where Ava Johnson remained connected to life-sustaining equipment, her presence steady yet fragile within the controlled environment. For a moment, his thoughts moved beyond the present into fragmented memory, recalling how she had always operated with quiet consistency in his household, never drawing attention yet maintaining order in ways that only became visible in hindsight. Those memories now contrasted sharply with the sterile urgency of the hospital setting, where every detail was being measured, documented, and re-evaluated under scrutiny. A nurse adjusted a monitor setting carefully, while another staff member moved through the corridor with deliberate caution, reflecting the heightened awareness that had spread throughout the hospital. Dr. Grant explained that the investigation was now expanding to include communication logs and authorization chains to determine whether procedural interference had contributed to the delay. Ethan nodded once, then requested full identification of every individual who had access to Ava Johnson from the moment of her arrival until the present time. His voice remained calm, but the expectation behind the request was absolute, signaling that the situation had moved beyond observation into active reconstruction of accountability. The compliance officer confirmed that the review was ongoing and that additional verification steps were being initiated to ensure accuracy. Around them, the hospital maintained its operational flow, but the atmosphere had shifted into something more controlled, as if every action now carried weight beyond its immediate function. And as Ethan Cole continued to stand outside the ICU, looking through the glass at Ava Johnson, it became clear that the situation had evolved into a deeper examination of everything that had led to this moment, where medical urgency and systemic accountability were now inseparably connected. The atmosphere outside the intensive care unit had become increasingly structured, as if the hospital itself had entered a state of silent coordination under unseen pressure. Ethan Cole remained in the same position, yet his presence now influenced the behavior of everyone around him in subtle but undeniable ways. Conversations were shorter, movements more precise, and even routine medical procedures seemed to occur with heightened awareness. Inside the ICU, Ava Johnson continued to lie under continuous monitoring, her condition still fragile but stabilized within narrow medical limits. Dr. Michael Grant returned with the hospital compliance officer once again, this time accompanied by a senior administrator whose expression reflected the seriousness of the ongoing internal review. They informed Ethan that the investigation into Ava Johnson's admission timeline had expanded into a full procedural audit covering all emergency intake activity across multiple departments during the relevant time window. Ethan listened without interruption, his attention unwavering, his focus shifting between the spoken details and the ICU room behind the glass. The compliance officer explained that electronic access logs, staff assignment records, and shift transition data were now being cross-verified to reconstruct an exact sequence of events. Preliminary findings confirmed multiple inconsistencies in timing between recorded intake and actual medical response initiation, creating measurable delays in critical care escalation. Dr. Grant carefully added that while no definitive conclusion of intentional interference had been established, the pattern of irregular entries required further verification through cross-departmental review. Ethan finally spoke, asking in a calm and controlled tone whether the hospital could identify a single accountable point within the sequence of delays. The administrator hesitated before responding that responsibility appeared distributed across overlapping roles, with no isolated individual yet confirmed as the sole cause, though one coordinating figure remained under close examination due to repeated system access during the critical period. That information created a noticeable shift in the environment, not through reaction, but through the weight of implication it carried. Ethan turned his gaze back toward the ICU glass, where Ava Johnson remained surrounded by machines that continued their steady readings, maintaining a fragile equilibrium between stability and uncertainty. For a brief moment, his thoughts moved through memory, recalling her quiet presence within his household, her consistent attention to detail, and the way she had maintained order without seeking acknowledgement. Those recollections now carried a different significance, as they contrasted sharply with the clinical environment surrounding her present condition. A nurse moved carefully through the corridor adjusting equipment logs, while another staff member reviewed monitor readings with heightened caution, reflecting the increased sensitivity within the hospital. Dr. Grant explained that communication records were now being analyzed to determine whether any external coordination or misrouting had influenced the intake sequence. Ethan nodded once, then requested full access to every individual who had interacted with Ava Johnson from initial admission through current stabilization. His voice remained steady, but the expectation behind the request left no room for ambiguity. The compliance officer confirmed that the review process was ongoing and that additional verification protocols had been activated to ensure complete accuracy of the findings. Around them, the hospital maintained its operational function, yet every action now appeared measured against an invisible standard of accountability. And as Ethan Cole continued to stand outside the ICU, observing Ava Johnson through the glass, the situation had clearly transitioned beyond medical urgency into a structured pursuit of clarity within a system that was now revealing its own internal fractures. The hospital environment had now fully transitioned into a state of controlled tension, where every movement, every sound, and every exchange of information felt like part of a larger system adjusting itself under pressure. Ethan Cole remained stationed outside the intensive care unit, yet his presence had become a defining factor in how the surrounding staff operated. Conversations were kept brief, steps were measured, and even routine updates were delivered with heightened caution. Inside the ICU, Ava Johnson remained under continuous observation, her condition still fragile but stabilized within the narrow limits maintained by medical intervention. Dr. Michael Grant returned once again, this time accompanied by the hospital compliance officer and a senior administrator whose expression reflected the increasing seriousness of the investigation. They informed Ethan that the internal audit had progressed into a full reconstruction of every action taken from the moment Ava Johnson entered the hospital system. This reconstruction included cross-referencing electronic access logs, staffing rotations, and emergency intake procedures across multiple departments. Ethan listened without interruption, his attention divided only between the information being presented and the ICU room visible through the glass. The compliance officer explained that the preliminary findings confirmed multiple inconsistencies in timing and authorization sequences, particularly during the critical intake window where Ava's condition required immediate escalation. These inconsistencies were not isolated, but appeared across several procedural points, suggesting systemic breakdown rather than a single error. Dr. Grant carefully added that while no formal conclusion regarding intent had been reached, the pattern of irregular entries required deeper verification through extended review of communication logs and internal routing data. Ethan finally spoke, asking in a calm and steady voice whether the hospital could confirm the exact point at which Ava Johnson's transfer to intensive care had been delayed beyond protocol requirements. The administrator hesitated before responding that the delay had occurred during a transition between intake coordination and emergency escalation approval, with overlapping responsibilities contributing to a lack of immediate action. That explanation created a quiet but noticeable shift in the atmosphere, not through emotional reaction, but through the weight of structural implication it carried. Ethan turned his gaze back toward the ICU glass, where Ava Johnson remained connected to monitoring equipment that tracked her fragile but stable condition. For a brief moment, his thoughts moved into memory, recalling her consistent presence within his household, her attention to detail in silence, and her ability to maintain order without acknowledgement or recognition. Those memories now carried a different significance, as they contrasted sharply with the clinical precision of the hospital environment surrounding her. A nurse moved carefully through the corridor adjusting monitoring records, while another staff member reviewed system logs with increased caution, reflecting the heightened awareness now present throughout the facility. Dr. Grant explained that communication records were being analyzed to determine whether any external influence or misrouting had contributed to the delay in care escalation. Ethan nodded once, then requested full verification of every individual who had access to Ava Johnson from admission through stabilization, including all shift transitions and emergency response personnel. His voice remained controlled, but the expectation behind the request was absolute, signaling that the situation had moved beyond observation into full accountability reconstruction. The compliance officer confirmed that the review process was ongoing and that additional validation protocols had been activated to ensure complete accuracy of the findings. Around them, the hospital continued to function, but every action now appeared measured against an invisible standard of scrutiny. And as Ethan Cole continued to stand outside the ICU, observing Ava Johnson through the glass, the situation had clearly evolved into a deeper systemic exposure where medical urgency and institutional accountability had become inseparably linked. The hospital had now entered a phase where every operational layer felt exposed under quiet but absolute scrutiny, as if the presence of Ethan Cole had reshaped the internal rhythm of the entire institution. Outside the intensive care unit, he remained in the same position, unmoving, yet fully aware of every subtle shift occurring around him. The hospital staff no longer moved with ordinary routine efficiency, instead, each action appeared measured, deliberate, and cautious, as though even minor errors could carry immediate consequences under the current level of attention. Inside the ICU, Ava Johnson continued to lie under constant monitoring, her condition still fragile but stabilized through continuous medical intervention. Dr. Michael Grant returned alongside the compliance officer and a senior hospital administrator, their expressions reflecting the final stage of an internal review that had expanded far beyond its original scope. They informed Ethan that the full reconstruction of Ava Johnson's admission timeline had been completed across all departments involved in emergency intake, stabilization procedures, and subsequent monitoring transitions. The results confirmed multiple procedural inconsistencies, including overlapping authorization entries, delayed escalation responses, and incomplete synchronization between intake logs and emergency care activation. Ethan listened without interruption, his focus unwavering, his attention shifting between the ICU room behind the glass and the structured explanation being delivered in front of him. The compliance officer carefully explained that while no single point of intentional interference had been definitively proven, the convergence of irregularities across multiple systems created a timeline that could not be explained by standard operational error alone. Dr. Grant added that communication records and access logs were now being fully audited to determine whether external coordination or internal misalignment had contributed to the delay in critical care escalation. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but absolute, asking whether the hospital could identify the precise sequence of responsibility during the window between Ava Johnson's arrival and her transfer into intensive care. The administrator paused before responding that responsibility was distributed across multiple overlapping roles, with transition points between departments creating gaps in immediate accountability. That explanation settled into the space without resolution, but with increasing weight, as if the structure of the entire hospital system was being quietly re-examined under pressure. Ethan turned his gaze back toward the ICU glass, where Ava Johnson remained surrounded by monitoring equipment that continued to track her fragile stability. For a brief moment, his thoughts drifted into memory, recalling her quiet presence within his household, her consistent attention to tasks without recognition, and her ability to maintain order in environments where she was never formally acknowledged. Those recollections now carried a deeper significance, standing in stark contrast to the sterile precision of the hospital environment and the systemic uncertainty now surrounding her condition. A nurse adjusted monitoring data at a nearby station while another staff member reviewed system entries with heightened caution, reflecting the increased sensitivity throughout the facility. Dr. Grant stated that additional verification protocols were being implemented to ensure no access point or communication link had been overlooked in the reconstruction process. Ethan nodded once, then requested confirmation that every individual who had interacted with Ava Johnson from initial intake through current stabilization had been fully accounted for without exception. His tone remained controlled, but the expectation embedded within the request was unmistakable, signaling that the process had moved beyond observation into complete accountability enforcement. The compliance officer confirmed that the review was still active and that final validation steps were underway to ensure total accuracy of all findings. Around them, the hospital maintained operational function, but every movement now appeared constrained by awareness of oversight, as if the institution itself had entered a state of continuous self-examination. And as Ethan Cole continued to stand outside the ICU, observing Ava Johnson through the glass, the situation had fully transitioned into a structured exposure of systemic failure and responsibility, where every layer of the hospital's operation was now subject to irreversible scrutiny. The hospital had now reached a critical point where every layer of its internal structure felt exposed under continuous scrutiny, as if the presence of Ethan Cole had transformed the entire institution into a system under silent evaluation. Outside the intensive care unit, he remained still, positioned at the threshold between observation and action, while the surrounding environment adjusted itself to the weight of his attention. Hospital staff moved with increased caution, their communication reduced to brief exchanges, and their movements carefully measured as if every detail could now be subject to review. Inside the ICU, Ava Johnson remained under constant monitoring, her condition fragile but stabilized within controlled medical parameters. Dr. Michael Grant returned once again alongside the compliance officer and senior administrator, their expressions now reflecting the final stage of an investigation that had expanded beyond routine procedural review into full systemic reconstruction. They informed Ethan that the complete audit of Ava Johnson's case had been finalized, including emergency intake logs, authorization records, communication trails, and departmental transition data. The findings confirmed a sequence of procedural inconsistencies that spanned multiple departments, including delayed escalation timing, overlapping authorization entries, and incomplete synchronization between intake and emergency response activation. Ethan listened without interruption, his focus steady, his attention alternating between the ICU room behind the glass and the structured explanation being delivered in front of him. The compliance officer carefully explained that while no single point of intentional interference had been officially confirmed, the cumulative pattern of irregularities created a timeline that could not be fully explained by standard operational failure alone. Dr. Grant added that communication records had been fully analyzed and that no clear External directive had been identified, but internal routing inefficiencies had contributed significantly to the delay in critical response. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but absolute, asking whether the hospital could identify a definitive breakdown point where responsibility had failed to activate appropriate emergency escalation. The administrator paused before responding that responsibility had been distributed across multiple overlapping roles, with transition gaps between departments preventing immediate accountability from being assigned to any single individual. That explanation settled into the space without resolution, reinforcing the structural complexity of what had occurred. Ethan turned his gaze back toward the ICU glass, where Ava Johnson remained under continuous observation, her condition unchanged in visible terms but still dependent on sustained medical support. For a brief moment, his thoughts shifted into memory, recalling her consistent presence within his household, her quiet efficiency, and the absence of any demand for recognition despite her steady contribution to his environment. Those recollections now contrasted sharply with the sterile precision of the hospital setting and the systemic uncertainty surrounding her current condition. A nurse carefully adjusted monitoring equipment while another staff member reviewed updated logs with heightened attention, reflecting the increased sensitivity throughout the facility. Dr. Grant stated that additional verification protocols had been implemented to ensure that every access point, communication channel, and procedural step had been fully accounted for without omission. Ethan nodded once, then requested final confirmation that all individuals who had interacted with Ava Johnson from admission through stabilization had been fully identified and verified. His voice remained controlled, but the expectation behind the request was absolute, signaling that the process had moved beyond observation into complete institutional accountability. The compliance officer confirmed that the review had reached its final validation stage and that all remaining discrepancies were being resolved through cross-departmental verification. Around them, the hospital maintained operational stability, but every action now appeared constrained by awareness of oversight, as if the entire system had entered a state of continuous self-examination. And as Ethan Cole continued to stand outside the ICU, observing Ava Johnson through the glass, the situation had fully transitioned into a complete exposure of systemic failure and responsibility, where every layer of institutional operation was now subject to irreversible clarity. The hospital had now reached a stage where every operational layer felt fully exposed under sustained scrutiny, as if the presence of Ethan Cole had transformed the entire institution into a controlled system of accountability. Outside the intensive care unit, he remained in place without movement, yet his stillness carried an intensity that influenced the behavior of everyone within sight. Hospital staff moved with deliberate caution, conversations were reduced to essential communication, and even routine tasks appeared to be executed under heightened awareness. Inside the ICU, Ava Johnson remained under continuous medical monitoring, her condition fragile but stable within carefully maintained clinical parameters. Dr. Michael Grant returned once again, accompanied by the compliance officer and senior hospital administrator, their expressions reflecting the final phase of an investigation that had now reached complete structural review. They informed Ethan that the full audit of Ava Johnson's case had been concluded, covering every aspect of emergency intake, departmental transitions, authorization sequences, and communication logs across the entire hospital network involved in her care. The findings confirmed a consistent pattern of procedural inconsistencies, including delayed escalation timing, overlapping authorization entries, and incomplete synchronization between intake processing and emergency response activation. Ethan listened without interruption, his attention unwavering, shifting only between the ICU room behind the glass and the structured explanation being delivered directly to him. The compliance officer carefully stated that, while no single act of intentional interference had been definitively proven, the combined irregularities across multiple departments created a timeline that deviated significantly from standard emergency protocol expectations. Dr. Grant added that internal communication records had been fully reviewed and that no external directive or coordinated interference had been identified, but internal system inefficiencies had played a critical role in delaying Ava Johnson's transfer to intensive care. Ethan finally spoke, his voice steady and absolute, asking whether the hospital could identify the precise structural failure point where emergency escalation should have been activated without delay. The administrator paused before responding that responsibility had been distributed across overlapping departmental roles, with transition gaps between intake coordination and emergency authorization preventing a single accountable trigger from being established. That explanation settled into the space without resolution, reinforcing the complexity of systemic failure rather than simplifying it. Ethan turned his gaze back toward the ICU glass, where Ava Johnson remained under continuous observation, her condition unchanged in visible appearance but sustained by ongoing medical intervention. For a brief moment, his thoughts moved through memory, recalling her consistent presence within his household, her quiet efficiency, and her ability to maintain order without requiring recognition or acknowledgement. Those memories now contrasted sharply with the sterile precision of the hospital environment and the structured uncertainty surrounding her current state. A nurse carefully adjusted monitoring data while another staff member reviewed updated system logs with heightened attention, reflecting the increased sensitivity across all hospital departments. Dr. Grant stated that additional verification protocols had been completed to ensure that every access point, communication channel, and procedural step had been fully accounted for without omission or discrepancy. Ethan nodded once, then requested final confirmation that every individual who had interacted with Ava Johnson from initial admission through stabilization had been fully identified, verified, and documented without exception. His tone remained controlled, but the expectation embedded within the request was absolute, signaling that the process had transitioned beyond observation into full institutional accountability enforcement. The compliance officer confirmed that the review had reached its final validation stage and that all remaining discrepancies had been resolved through cross-departmental verification procedures. Around them, the hospital maintained operational stability, but every movement now appeared constrained by awareness of oversight, as if the entire system had entered a continuous state of self-examination. And as Ethan Cole continued to stand outside the ICU, observing Ava Johnson through the glass, the situation had fully evolved into a complete exposure of systemic failure and responsibility, where every layer of institutional operation had been brought into irreversible clarity. The hospital had now reached its final stage of internal exposure, where every system, every department, and every procedural layer had been fully reviewed under continuous scrutiny. Outside the intensive care unit, Ethan Cole remained in the same position, unmoving, yet fully present in a way that influenced the entire environment around him. The hospital staff had entered a state of heightened discipline, where communication was minimal, movements were precise, and every action seemed measured against the awareness of ongoing oversight. Inside the ICU, Ava Johnson remained under continuous monitoring, her condition still fragile but stabilized through sustained medical intervention. Dr. Michael Grant returned alongside the compliance officer and senior hospital administrator, their expressions reflecting closure rather than investigation, as if the process they had been conducting had reached its final point of resolution. They informed Ethan that the complete audit of Ava Johnson's case had been finalized without remaining discrepancies. Every stage of emergency intake, departmental transition, authorization flow, and communication exchange had been fully reconstructed and verified across all participating units. The findings confirmed that while multiple procedural inconsistencies had occurred, there was no single confirmed act of intentional interference, but rather a distributed sequence of delays and administrative breakdowns within overlapping emergency response protocols. Ethan listened without interruption, his attention steady, his gaze alternating between the ICU room behind the glass and the structured conclusion being presented before him. The compliance officer carefully explained that all personnel involved in Ava Johnson's admission and stabilization had been identified and documented, and that corrective procedural measures had already been implemented to prevent similar delays in future emergency cases. Dr. Grant added that hospital systems had been updated to enforce stricter synchronization between intake authorization and emergency escalation, ensuring that response timing would no longer depend on overlapping departmental transitions. Ethan remained silent for a moment after the explanation ended, his expression unchanged, but his focus had shifted from investigation to resolution. He turned his gaze back toward Ava Johnson, who remained inside the ICU under steady monitoring, her condition unchanged in visible form but now supported by fully stabilized medical systems. For a brief moment, his thoughts moved through memory once more, recalling her quiet presence within his household, her consistent attention to detail, and her ability to maintain order without seeking recognition or acknowledgement. Those memories now felt distant yet defining, shaping the way he perceived the situation that had unfolded. A nurse nearby completed a final equipment check, while another staff member closed updated system logs, signaling the conclusion of the audit process. The hospital environment, once tense with investigation, had now returned to operational stability, though every movement still carried a trace of caution. Dr. Grant confirmed that all investigative procedures were formally concluded and that Ava Johnson's case had been transitioned fully back to medical care without further administrative intervention. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, acknowledging the completion without further instruction or demand. The silence that followed was no longer procedural but final, as if the entire structure of uncertainty had been resolved into clarity. Around them, the hospital continued its normal function, but the moment carried a sense of irreversible closure. And as Ethan Cole stood outside the ICU, observing Ava Johnson through the glass, the situation that had once been defined by crisis, investigation, and systemic exposure now settled into a quiet state of resolution, where accountability had been fully established and the only remaining presence was the continuity of life itself under restored stability.